I've thought long and hard about how to share this with anyone. I don't know if it'll lead to some sort of validation or just further isolation, but here goes nothing. I can't believe I'm even writing this. People often say how a single moment can change your life forever. I never really understood that until the summer I turned 23. I was aimlessly wandering through a dilapidated thrift store on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that smelled like rotten wood and stale air. I remember getting lost in the aisles, endlessly browsing old clothes and books, trying to find something unique. That's when I found it, a dusty, leather-bound journal wedged between two cracked encyclopedias. The moment I picked it up, I felt this strange energy radiating from it, as if it were alive. The cover had no title, just an intricate design of swirling vines and impossibly detailed symbols. I flipped through the pages, only to discover they were all blank. It didn't seem special at first, but something pulled me to it, a whisper in the back of my head telling me to take it home. So, I did. That night, I settled down at my rickety kitchen table with the journal in hand, the soft glow of a single lamp casting shadows across the walls. As I picked up a pen and pressed it to the first page, I felt a rush of anticipation, like I was about to unlock some long-buried secret. I wrote the date, then a simple phrase, what if I could visit any moment in time? The second I finished writing, I felt the room shift. The air grew thick, and a sensation like cold wind rushed around me, tightening and tugging at my clothes. I looked around, confused, but nothing seemed different. Just as I was about to brush it off as a weird coincidence, a blinding light engulfed me, and the world around me warped into something unrecognizable. One moment, I was in my kitchen, the next, I was standing in the middle of a bustling market square, the vibrant colors and sounds overwhelming my senses. It felt real, so real it was like stepping into a painting. The scent of spices and fresh bread filled the air, drawing me forward. Before I even had a chance to think, I start walking, curiosity propelling me through the crowd. I spent what felt like hours wandering, vendors selling wares, children laughing, musicians playing joyful tunes. Everything was bright, alive, and enchanting. After a time, I saw a man sitting under a large tree, sketching furiously in a notebook. Something about him caught my eye, and the instinct to approach him was undeniable. As I got closer, I could see he was capturing the life around him, each stroke precise and thoughtful. "Incredible, isn't it?" he said, looking up and meeting my gaze. His voice held a warmth to it, and I felt an inexplicable connection. For the next few moments, we talked, and I learned his name was Elias. He spoke with passion about art, dreams, and life, things that had been suffocating in my chest for years. I found myself sharing more and more with him. Eventually, I told him my secret about the journal and how I had found myself here, in this time, in this place. He stared at me for a long moment before breaking into a knowing smile. "Time is just a river, my friend," he said, "and we are all mere travelers." His words struck me like lightning. There was something almost magical about him, a wisdom that I desperately craved. Before I knew it, I was leaning in closely, just soaking in everything he had to say, and for several days, I would return to the market square just to sit with him, learning, exploring new thoughts, and sharing my fears. But soon enough, I noticed something unsettling. People began to look at me differently, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion. One day while walking past the vendors, I heard whispers about the strange one and the lost soul. My heart dropped as paranoia sunk in, and that feeling of connection to Elias began to blur. When I finally confronted him about it, he smiled, but there was a darkness in his gaze. "You must understand, some moments are not meant to be visited. They have their own purpose." I wanted to argue, to retort that I had every right to be there, but I could feel a heaviness building in the air. A chill crept down my spine as he continued, "If you stay too long, you might lose yourself entirely." Those words echoed in my mind like a haunting refrain, but the pull of this extraordinary life held me captive. I couldn't just leave, could I? The journal had given me this wondrous chance to experience life in a new light, and every fiber of my being screamed to hold on to it. So, instead of retreating, I dug deeper. As days morphed into weeks, I started experimenting with the journal, writing down various phrases, thoughts, and wishes, each time willing myself to go further. I danced through ages, skipping from one moment to another, tasting and feeling experiences that were never mine, ancient wars, artistic revolutions, even mundane moments of love and loss. But every time I returned to Elias, I could feel time reshaping around us, bending under my will. From the joy radiating from his laughter to the way his eyes glazed over with worry as I shared my growing obsession, I was leaving a mark on this world, and not all of it was good. The whispers grew into full-blown murmurs, shadowing my presence like vultures, making my heart race with unease. One evening, I returned to the market square and found Elias waiting alone, his expression unreadable. "You need to stop," he warned, "before it's too late. You're changing things in ways you can't understand." I shook my head, feeling anger bubble under my skin. "No, this is exhilarating. I can be whoever I want here." His eyes darkened. "That's exactly the problem." I felt a sudden jolt, as though the ground beneath me shifted, and then he vanished. I was alone in the crowd, but the joyful chatter had turned into unsettling whispers, eyes watching me from every corner. I could feel their stares, their judgment, and slowly panic set in. I realized I had stepped too far, too often, and the weight of those moments began to crush me. That night, I fumbled for the journal under the dim light in my room, flipping through the blank pages, desperate to find a solution. I started frantically writing, each word a plea to fix what felt irreparably broken between me and this new world. But as I filled the pages, desperation gnawed at me. The more I wrote, the more distorted reality became. My vision blurred, and I felt myself spiraling down this endless pit, losing my grasp on time itself. The last thing I remember was the sensation of falling, like gravity had suddenly ceased to exist, and then I blinked, waking up in my kitchen, back in the present. Heart racing, I felt disoriented, as if I had just awakened from a fever dream. But something wasn't right. The journal lay open on the table, the pages flipping wildly as though someone were flipping through them. I reached out hesitantly, but the moment I touched it, everything started to fade away. I thought I was going to lose consciousness again. After a few tortured breaths, I found myself in a new reality. My apartment was the same but different, as though the air was tinged with a heavy sorrow. I looked around, but something vital felt missing. My phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. "We miss you," it read, "come back." Time had shifted again, but this time I realized I had left something behind, too many moments altered, too many lives touched. The faces of the people I encountered were etched in my mind, but I had lost them. I could never return. My hands trembled as I closed the journal, the weight of my adventure sitting like a leaden stone in my gut. I had chased thrills, ignoring the danger lurking beneath that intoxicating freedom, and the cost of that adventure was my past. I never wrote in that journal again, but sometimes, in quiet moments, I sense a pull, a calling to adventure once more. A whisper reminding me that time, with all its grace and mystery, should never be trifled with. And maybe that's why, even now, as I share this with you, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. There's a darkness lurking just beyond the surface, an echo of shadows that ripple through time. And to anyone reading this, remember, be careful what adventures you embark on. Some can lead you to places from which you may never return. Because the time I went on an adventure that changed my life has left me in a reality I never wanted, separated from a world I can never touch again. When I decided to change careers, my journey. When I decided to change careers, it felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into the unknown. I'd been working as a software developer for nearly a decade, and while the job was stable and paid well, it felt like my soul was slowly eroding with every day that passed. My entire adult life, I'd gone through the motions of working, saving, and repeating the cycle, telling myself that stability was everything. I never really questioned the path I was on because, well, it's what you're supposed to do, right? Work hard, build your life, create security for yourself. But lately, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that there was something missing. The long days spent staring at a screen, debugging code, patching systems for bugs I didn't care about, all started to feel like an endless loop of monotony. I kept it to myself for a long time, fearing what people would say if I admitted I wanted out. Friends, family, coworkers, they all expected me to stay put, climb the corporate ladder, eventually make my way to some cushy corner office where I'd be seen as successful. But I couldn't ignore the emptiness any longer. The decision to change careers wasn't an impulsive one, it was like a slow burn that had been building for years. Every morning, as I poured my coffee, I'd feel a sinking feeling in my chest, like I was being drawn into something that wasn't meant for me. Then, one morning, after another late night spent obsessing over job listings, articles on passion careers, and stories of people who left everything behind to pursue their dreams, I realized I couldn't keep lying to myself. I needed a change, and not just a small one. I wanted a fresh start, a path that would make me feel alive again. I didn't know exactly what that looked like, but I had this strange, almost irrational urge to pursue something creative, something where I could work with my hands. I'd always been interested in carpentry, oddly enough. Maybe it was a phase, maybe it was some leftover dream from when I was a kid building things with my dad in the garage, but the idea of working with wood, creating something tangible, felt like a way to reconnect with who I was before life pushed me into tech. It sounded crazy to everyone I told. You want to leave a six-figure salary to become a carpenter? My parents were beside themselves. Friends thought I was kidding. Even my partner thought I was just going through some sort of midlife crisis. But the more resistance I faced, the more determined I felt, like I was defending something precious that no one else could understand. I saved up for a few more months, tightening my spending, and started going to night classes in carpentry after work. The first time I handled a chisel, that rough, raw feeling of cutting into wood, the smell of sawdust filling the air, it was exhilarating. It was so different from the sterile, sanitized world of coding and offices. Here, my mistakes were real, tangible, they couldn't be fixed by a simple backspace or undo command. The wood would split if I wasn't careful, a project could be ruined in an instant, and somehow, that was what drew me in deeper. I was hooked on that feeling of raw creation. I started making small pieces at first, a few shelves, a coffee table. They were rough, far from perfect, but they were mine, created with my hands, and that was enough for me. Soon, people began to notice. A coworker asked if I'd make a table for her. Then a friend wanted a custom bookshelf. Word got around, and suddenly I had orders coming in faster than I could keep up. I was working late into the night, my apartment filled with half-finished projects, tools scattered everywhere. It was chaotic, exhausting, but I was finally doing something that felt right, like I was working towards something real, something I could be proud of. It wasn't long before I reached a crossroads. My manager called me into his office one day, mentioning that I seemed distracted lately, and that if my performance didn't improve, they'd have to reevaluate my position. Part of me wanted to laugh because I already knew what my answer would be. I walked out of that office with my head held high, knowing that I was finally breaking free. Quitting was terrifying, of course. I built my entire life around this idea of security, and here I was, throwing it all away for something that could fail at any moment. I burned my safety net, and there was no going back. But the first morning after I left that job, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. No alarm, no dreaded commute, just a quiet calm as I sipped my coffee, knowing I was finally doing something that mattered to me. My little woodworking business started to grow. I rented a tiny workshop, moved all my tools in, and started working full-time. The orders kept coming, and slowly, I gained a reputation for my work. People loved the personal touch I put into each piece, the way every cut, every finish told a story. I learned something else, too. There was a beauty in the imperfections, in the small flaws that made each piece unique. One day, as I was finishing up a dining table for a couple who had driven 3 hours to pick it up, the woman told me it was exactly what they'd been looking for, something handmade, crafted with care. It hit me in that moment that I was doing something meaningful, bringing a small bit of joy into people's lives with something I'd created with my own 2 hands. It wasn't glamorous, and I wasn't making as much money as I had before, but for the first time, I was truly happy. Looking back, I can't believe I spent so many years afraid to make this change, trapped by the fear of failure, of disappointing others. But now, standing here in my workshop, surrounded by the tools and pieces that make up my new life, I know it was all worth it. This journey taught me that sometimes, you have to take a leap, to risk everything, in order to find yourself again.
When I was a kid, my mom would often forget my existence, and it felt like our house was just a set of walls wearing the skin of the family, devoid of love or warmth. Birthdays were spent in silence, where I would blow out my candles while she stared blankly at her phone, and school plays were met with empty seats where I so desperately wanted her to be, only to later find her scrolling through social media, claiming she had prior commitments. Throughout the years, my friends sensed the void and tried to fill it with their own families, for which I was infinitely grateful, but the ache of my mother's absence was stifling. By the time I reached my teenage years, I was determined to be the opposite of her, I wandered into social clubs, forged new friendships, and leaned on surrogate parents who saw me for who I was. I dreamed of a wedding day bathed in love and support, surrounded by those who cherished me. Fast forward to my engagement, and the planning was thrilling until the moment my mom called me. She wanted to talk about dresses, flowers, and how she couldn't wait to be at my side. It shocked me. I had lived in a shadow where she rarely acknowledged my achievements, let alone my milestones. The memories of her dismissals flooded back like a tidal wave, drowning out the joy of my impending nuptials. I remember telling her, voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt, that I wasn't comfortable with her being a part of the wedding. It felt like an enormous weight had been lifted off my chest, but her silence on the other end showed me that she was just as aloof as ever. Friends and family, who knew the history, stood by me, calling me brave and self-aware. They understood that her absence was a wound I'd carried too long to let her walk down that aisle like she had been by my side all these years. But just days before the wedding, I received a letter from my mom. The words were shaky and filled with remorse, reflecting a woman trying to recall who I was. "I may have been absent," she wrote, "but I am still your mother. Please let me be there on your special day. Maybe we can start anew?" The conflicting emotions hit me hard like a truck. Could someone who had ignored me for years really want to fix things at the last minute? The day of the wedding arrived. The venue was beautiful, draped with flowers, and everyone I loved encircled me. My heart swelled as my soon-to-be spouse took my hands. The ceremony began, and laughter and joy filled the air, everything that had been missing for so long. But then, out of the corner of my eye, my mom stepped in, her wrinkled face almost unrecognizable against the light, seemingly floating in a sheer white dress that clashed horrifically with my colors. My heart sank, and I suddenly felt trapped, surrounded by love while being suffocated by resentment. The words she once spoke melted into a long-forgotten childhood echo. She smiled wide, thinking it was all forgiven like it was a bad dream we could wake up from. Panic surged through me as guests noticed her presence, shifting their attention from the altar to the dissonance unfolding before them. It felt like a wretched scene in a horror film, where the doors are flung open, and the monster emerges, but in this case, it was my mom, reminding me of all the voids I had struggled to fill. The soft music shifted into an eerie silence, the world around me began to fade, and I was left holding the weight of my choice. I stepped forward, shaking, not knowing whether to scream or cry. With her hand reaching out to me, I felt a paralysis of feelings I didn't know existed: love, fear, hatred, and duty all roiling in my gut. It was the moment I was meant to be standing where joy thrived, but instead, I felt like a ghost of my past. Memories crashed in like the plates I had once broken against the wall in anger, each fragment representing an unfulfilled mother's embrace. "What are you doing here?" I finally asked, voice trembling. A silence hung thick, the sound of my heart pounding echoed off the walls as her smile faltered. The world was watching. I had a decision to make: to let her in, despite the years of neglect, or to sever the bond that tried to tether me back to a place I never belonged. In that moment, I turned my back on her. Muffled gasps filled the air as I walked back towards the altar, the warmth of my partner's hand jolting me back to reality as I spoke. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this." And as I stood there, amidst vows and promises, the memory of her fading presence cut deeper than any sharp object could. After the ceremony concluded, I expected anger and fury, but instead heard nothing. She slipped away into the chaos, just like she always had. Months passed, filled with the joyous celebrations of a new life, but whispers of gossip reached me: how spiteful I had been, how harsh the decision seemed to friends, and I'd be lying if I said guilt didn't creep in every now and then. But then, I remembered the weight on my shoulders, the ghost of neglect that surrounded me for so long. Everyone has their stories, but mine felt like a horror story unraveling, where love is often the most horrifying monster of all. As I scrolled through social media one night, distraught over her absence, a post caught my eye, a single image of my mother standing at the very venue, the backdrop draped with flowers where our lives had taken separate paths. The caption read, "That empty feeling. Sometimes love isn't strong enough to fill the void." And I realized that her presence had never been about love, it was just another shadow, another appearance filled with obligation. In the end, I had made my choice. I had chosen people who mattered, those who saw me while I was invisible, and I swore I wouldn't let the ghost of my past haunt my future. So here I am, torn between being that little girl dreaming of her mother's love and the adult who learned to survive without it, wrestling with the consequences of familial ties, and affirming to myself that it's okay to choose those who choose you back. There's power in that decision, one steeped in anguish yet wrapped in self-discovery, and I now carry it with me like a talisman, a cruel lesson but a necessary one, reminding me that sometimes, you must close the door to move forward.
I never really understood gratitude until it became a necessity for my survival. It all started when I moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, far from the bustling city life I was used to. The air was crisper, the nights were darker, and the people were peculiar, to say the least. I didn't have a job lined up, I was just trying to escape the drudgery of my old life, thinking a change of scenery would heal my restless soul. Little did I know I'd find myself entangled in a nightmare that would ultimately teach me the value of gratitude and the power of perspective. My first few weeks went by in a blur, filled with long walks through the forest and attempting to set up my little cottage. It felt peaceful at first, but as days wore on, I began to notice strange occurrences around me. Things would go missing, my favorite mug, my keys, a book I had been reading, only to show up later in odd places like under the bed or in the refrigerator. When I spoke to the neighbors about it, they simply nodded with knowing smiles and said, "You'll get used to it." Used to what? I asked silently. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, a byproduct of too much silence and too little human interaction. But then one night, while trying to prepare for bed, I heard whispers coming from outside my window. It sounded like laughter mixed with soft humming, and it sent chills down my spine. I pulled the curtains tight, convincing myself it was the wind or some nocturnal animal. Yet, the strings of uneasy tension in my gut unraveled that night when I closed my eyes. Sleep clutched at my thoughts, but then a dream took me to a familiar place. I was wandering through a dark forest, disoriented and afraid, the whispers echoing around me. They grew louder, pleading, begging. I remember one figure stepping into the moonlight, an older woman with wild hair and deep-set eyes that glimmered with mischief. She smiled, but it was empty, void of any warmth. "You're not grateful," she whispered, her breath ghosting over my skin like a chill. I jolted awake, my heart racing, the room cloaked in darkness. That was when I understood that I couldn't keep living in ungrateful silence. The very next day, I ventured deeper into the woods, hoping to clear my mind and maybe even confront whatever spirit had invaded my dreams. The trees towered above me, branches intertwining like gnarled fingers trying to hold me back. Just when I thought I would turn back, I stumbled upon a clearing with an ancient-looking stone altar at its center. It was covered in moss and surrounded by vibrant flowers that somehow thrived in the shade. It was breathtaking, and I felt a strange compulsion to kneel before it. As I knelt, I summoned all my worries, my fears, and my anger. But from these dark places, gratitude began to blossom. I thought of the coffee I sipped every morning, the warmth of my lined sweater against the chill, the beauty of the forest around me. I uttered quiet thanks for the air in my lungs and the ground beneath me. And as those words escaped my lips, something magical happened. The wind picked up, swirling around me, rustling the leaves and lifting the flowers from their slumber. The whispered laughter returned, now sounding jubilant and harmonious, no longer a source of anxiety, but a celebration of life. I didn't look behind me, but I could feel them, those who had been watching, waiting for me to learn. Day after day, I returned to that sacred clearing. I cultivated gratitude through ritual, each acknowledgement like a seed planted in rich soil. With each visit, the spirits grew closer, their forms shifting in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. They didn't torment me anymore, they danced along with my thoughts, accepting my offerings of thanks. I began to embrace the wonders of my mundane life. Every small act became an opportunity for gratitude. When I found my missing items, I laughed instead of groaned, thanking the spirits for the reminder to appreciate the little things. I started to forge connections with my neighbors, sharing meals and stories. I realized they weren't strange, they were just alive in a way that was foreign to me. I finally felt like a part of this community, a web of gratitude and understanding. But there was something lurking at the edge of my new perspective. I knew I was being watched, but not in a malicious way. They were waiting for the moment when I would fully understand. On a particularly foggy morning, I dreamt of the old woman again. She stood before me, no longer a sinister figure but a wise sage dressed in flowing robes made of winds and shadows. "You've learned well," she said, her voice soothing my lingering fears. "But there's one more lesson." I followed her design, wading through the fog until we reached an expansive, dark lake shimmering under an ethereal light. "Face the depths," she beckoned. With great trepidation, I approached the water's edge and peered into my reflection. Staring back at me was my fear, all the anger and loneliness I had tried to bury. "You must accept even this," she told me. "Only then will you truly be free." And in that moment, I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the frigid water, feeling it surge around me, enveloping me in its icy grasp. I recognized my past failures, the shadows that had clung to my spirit. And instead of fighting, I surrendered, embracing every struggle, every sorrow. I emerged gasping for air, renewed, the weight of my past no longer dragging me down. The lake, once dark and foreboding, sparkled with hues of gratitude I had never witnessed before. In the days that followed, I felt lighter, filled with a newfound appreciation for everything the world offered. The spirits began to take form more often, no longer mere shadows but shimmering lights, guiding me through the tasks of everyday life. They helped me navigate the complexities of relationships, urged me to speak kind words and dress my thoughts in gratitude. Then, one evening, as I ventured back to the altar for my ritual, the night air filled with warmth and laughter. The community had gathered to celebrate harvest season, their joy infectious. I smiled and joined the festivities, no longer an outsider but a cherished part of the fabric woven into their lives. Gratitude had transformed my darkness into light, my fears into strength. And as the stars twinkled above, I felt the spirits dancing among us, celebrating my journey in ways I could have never imagined. In the end, it was gratitude that saved me, not because the darkness vanished, but because I learned to coexist with it, transforming my fear into appreciation. And every day since then, I find something to be thankful for, knowing that the cadence of life sways in rhythm with the whispers of invisible friends guiding me through the intricate dance of existence. I still walk through the woods, where laughter and whispers weave a tapestry of understanding, gratitude forever etched into my heart, my new normal holding an eerie yet beautiful semblance of what I once feared. I found out my partner had a secret family. What should I do? I had always believed that my partner, Ethan, was the epitome of love and devotion. Our relationship was built on trust, or so I thought. We had been together for 3 years, and every day felt like a new adventure. We laughed together, supported each other through tough times, and shared dreams of a future filled with happiness. But one fateful evening, everything changed. It was a Friday night, and I was looking forward to a cozy night in. I had just come home from work, exhausted but excited to spend time with Ethan. As I walked into the living room, I noticed something odd, a small envelope sitting on the coffee table. It was addressed to Ethan, but I didn't recall seeing it before. My heart raced with curiosity, and against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a small card that read, "Can't wait to see you again. Love, A." My blood ran cold. I felt my stomach twist into knots as I tried to process what I had just read. Who was A? And why were they writing to Ethan in such an intimate way? I tried to shake off the unease and confront him about it. "Ethan, can we talk?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He walked in with a smile, but that smile quickly faded when he saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched on his features. I held up the card, and his expression shifted. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice suddenly tense. "It was on the coffee table." "Who is A?" I demanded, my heart racing as I awaited his answer. "It's nothing. Just an old friend," he replied, but there was a tremor in his voice that made my skin crawl. "An old friend? You don't just receive love notes from old friends, Ethan. This is something more." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I watched as his eyes darted away from mine, avoiding the truth. "Please, just drop it," he pleaded. "It's not what you think." But how could I drop it? Something was clearly off, and the gnawing feeling in my gut urged me to dig deeper. As the evening wore on, I found myself unable to concentrate. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. How could the person I trusted the most be hiding something so significant? The thoughts swirled in my head, and before I knew it, I was determined to find out the truth. The next day, I decided to do some detective work. I knew I had to find out who A was, so I spent hours on social media, searching for any clue. I combed through Ethan's friends, searching for anyone with an initial A. I finally stumbled upon a woman named Alice. Her profile was filled with photos of her and Ethan together, laughing and embracing like they were a couple. The walls around me felt like they were closing in. I scrolled through her page, and it was as if I had uncovered a hidden world, a life I didn't know existed. In one picture, they were on a beach, their arms wrapped around each other, looking so in love. My heart sank. I felt nauseous as I continued to dig deeper, finding posts where Alice referred to Ethan as her boyfriend. A knot tightened in my stomach as the pieces fell into place. I had to confront him, but I needed to gather more evidence first. The following week, I decided to follow Ethan one day. I wanted to see where he went when he said he was working late. I watched him leave the house, my heart racing as I slipped into my car and followed him. It was a nerve-wracking drive, and I fought the urge to turn back, but my determination pushed me forward. He led me to a quaint little house on the outskirts of town, a place I had never seen before. As I parked down the street, my heart raced with a mix of fear and anger. I watched as he approached the front door and knocked. A few moments later, the door swung open, and there she was, Alice. My heart shattered as I watched them embrace, their chemistry undeniable. I felt like I was living in a twisted nightmare. I couldn't believe this was happening. I had given Ethan my heart, my trust, and he was giving it to someone else. I fought back tears, my mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and heartbreak. I was about to confront him right then and there when I saw something that made my blood run cold: children. 2 little kids ran out of the house, squealing with delight as they rushed into Ethan's arms. My heart sank as I realized he had a family, something he had kept hidden from me for who knows how long. I felt like I was suffocating, my chest tightening as the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. How could he do this to me? My mind raced with questions. Was I just a fling? Did he ever truly love me? The weight of betrayal crushed me as I watched the scene unfold in front of me. My entire world was crumbling, and I felt utterly helpless. I waited until they went inside before I finally drove home, tears streaming down my face. The betrayal felt like a wound that would never heal. For days, I struggled with what to do. Part of me wanted to confront Ethan, to demand answers and to expose him for what he was, a liar and a cheat. But another part of me was terrified. What if he denied everything? What if he twisted the story to make me look like the villain? I needed to gather my thoughts, to find a way to confront him without losing control. Finally, I decided to sit him down and lay it all out. One evening, as we were preparing dinner together, I felt a surge of courage. "Ethan, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady. He looked at me, the concern in his eyes betraying the calmness he tried to project. "What's wrong?" "I found something, and I can't ignore it any longer," I said, taking a deep breath. "Who is Alice?" The silence that followed was deafening. His face drained of color, and I watched as he opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. "You know who she is, don't you?" I pressed, refusing to let him dodge the truth. "She's just a friend," he stammered, but I wasn't buying it. "A friend who you've been lying to me about for years?" I pressed. "A friend you have children with?" The color returned to his face, but this time it was anger. "What are you talking about?" He snapped. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I followed you, Ethan. I saw you with her and the kids. How could you do this to me?" His expression shifted, and for a moment, I saw vulnerability in his eyes, but it quickly morphed into defensiveness. "You don't understand. It's complicated." "Complicated?" I shouted. "You've been lying to me. You've built a whole other life while I was here waiting for you." The confrontation escalated, emotions running high as we shouted back and forth. He tried to justify his actions, claiming he didn't want to hurt me, that he loved me but didn't know how to end things with Alice. But all I could hear were excuses. The betrayal cut deep, and the love I once felt for him turned to resentment. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to jump into the unknown. In the end, I told him I couldn't stay in a relationship built on lies. I packed my bags and walked out, the weight of the decision heavy on my shoulders. As I drove away, tears streamed down my face, but a strange sense of relief washed over me. I realized that I deserved better, that I was worthy of love and honesty. In the months that followed, I focused on healing. I sought therapy, surrounded myself with supportive friends, and began to rebuild my life. I learned to let go of the pain, to embrace the future with open arms. It was a long and difficult journey, but I emerged stronger and more resilient than ever. As for Ethan, I never looked back. He tried to contact me, but I blocked him on everything. I refused to let his lies seep back into my life. I had found my voice, and I was determined to reclaim my happiness. I discovered that sometimes, losing someone you love can lead to finding yourself. So if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember to trust your instincts and value your worth. You deserve a love that's true and unwavering, not one built on deception. I never thought rejection could lead me to find my true strength, but I guess life has a way of surprising you. It all started on an overcast Tuesday in March. I had just graduated from college with a degree in psychology, and my dream was to become a therapist. The job market was brutal, but I kept my hopes up and sent my resume to every clinic in the area. After weeks of anxious waiting, I finally got a call for an interview at a small, well-respected clinic. My heart raced as I prepared, visualizing every detail of that conversation. I practiced my answers, dressed in my best outfit, and arrived 30 minutes early on the day of the interview. However, as I sat in that sterile waiting room with beige walls and uncomfortable plastic chairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. When I was finally called in, I took a deep breath, smiled, and introduced myself. The panel, a stern-looking woman with glasses, a younger man with messy hair, and an older man in a crisp suit, welcomed me in. I answered their questions with enthusiasm, drawing on personal experiences and my studies. But as the interview progressed, I noticed subtle shifts in their demeanor. The younger man leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, while the older man scribbled notes with an unimpressed look. My heart sank, but I pushed through, eager to convey my passion for helping others. At the end, they thanked me for my time, and I left, feeling a knot forming in my stomach as I stepped back into the damp air outside. Days passed until I received that fateful call. I was sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through endless job boards when my phone buzzed. With a mix of hope and dread, I answered. "Thank you for your interest in the position, but we've decided to go in a different direction," the woman on the other end said. My heart shattered, scattering pieces of hope across the floor. I thanked her politely, but as soon as I hung up, I collapsed. I was drowning in rejection, my dreams slipping through my fingers. I spent the next few days in a haze, wallowing in my disappointment. I wanted to cry, shout, something, but all I could do was binge-watch cooking shows and pretend everything was fine. My friends tried to rally me, offering support and encouragement, but I brushed them off. I became a hermit, shutting myself in, trapped in my own thoughts and spiraling deeper into despair. It wasn't until one evening, while staring blankly at my laptop, that I received an unexpected message from Charlie, a guy I hadn't spoken to in years. We had been friends in high school, but life had pulled us in different directions. He said he was coming back to our hometown, and I should join him for coffee. I was hesitant at first, overcome by embarrassment and insecurity, but something within me urged me to take that step. I responded affirmatively with the faint hope that maybe reconnecting could lift my spirits. We met at a quaint cafe, the scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air. There he was, the same goofy grin from years past, completely unaware of my struggles. We talked for hours, reminiscing about old times. He mentioned how he had faced his own rejections after struggling to land jobs right after college. As he shared his story, something clicked inside me. I realized how resilience was a theme we all grappled with at various points in our lives. To my surprise, I found myself confiding in him about my recent rejection and the darkness that followed. Charlie listened intently, nodding with empathy, and shared his own moments of fear and failure. It was refreshing, this raw honesty. He didn't tell me to brush it off or suggest empty platitudes. Instead, he talked about how he overcame his challenges by focusing on his passions. "It's okay to feel lost," he said thoughtfully, "but don't let it define you. You're stronger than you think." Those words stuck with me. They ignited a spark that I had been desperately trying to extinguish, the idea that rejection wasn't the end, but perhaps a redirection towards something better. In the weeks that followed, buoyed by my conversation with Charlie, I decided to pivot. I went back to my roots of helping others, but in a different way. I signed up for volunteer work at a local shelter where I could offer emotional support to those in need. Each session, I learned not only about their struggles but also about the strengths they possessed. They fought battles I could hardly fathom, yet so many of them carried remarkable resilience, something I desperately needed to emulate. Gradually, I began to feel a shift within myself. Each story I heard became a thread that stitched up the gaping holes left by my rejection. I encountered people who inspired me with their tenacity. A single mother working 2 jobs, a veteran struggling with PTSD, a teenager determined to break free from the cycle of poverty, all confident that they had the power to shape their destiny despite their circumstances. Through the lens of their experiences, I discovered a newfound perspective. I threw myself into my work, embracing every moment, using it as a tool for healing. I practiced active listening, and empathy became a skill I polished with each session. Months passed, the weight of rejection slowly lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose. I had developed my strength not as a therapist but as a human being. I learned to face life's disappointments with a braver heart. And then, as I thrived in volunteering, an unexpected opportunity arose. The same clinic that had previously rejected me reached out. They had an opening for a support role, and before I knew it, the universe blessed me with a chance to work alongside the very people who had once turned me away. This time, I walked in with confidence, equipped with experiences that deepened my understanding of the human spirit. The interview felt different. I wasn't just a candidate seeking a job, I was a person who had faced failures and emerged resilient. By the time I left, I knew whether I got the position or not, I had already won. I carried that sentiment with me into the next chapter of my life. Rejection had carved out space for growth, filled with lessons of humility and strength. Now, as I sit here writing this, I can confidently say facing rejection was the catalyst I needed. It made me dig deeper and reassess who I wanted to be in this world. So if you're reading this and feeling defeated by rejection, know that behind every setback lies the potential for unimaginable growth. You may not see it now, but sometimes the door to your true calling only opens after addressing the lies rejection tells you. Embrace the pain. Let it guide you toward your strength, and you just might find something extraordinary along the way. A random act of kindness changed my day. A random act of kindness changed my day was how it all started, or at least, how I thought it started, because that morning I had barely managed to drag myself out of bed and into some semblance of a routine. Everything felt off, like the world was playing a cruel joke that only I was in on. My alarm didn't go off, my favorite shirt was wrinkled beyond repair, I spilled coffee on myself just as I was walking out the door. By the time I made it to the coffee shop near work, I was done, absolutely ready to call in sick and crawl back under my covers. But then, as I reached the counter, fumbling through my wallet, I heard a voice beside me say, "It's on me." I looked up to see a stranger, maybe in his 50s, dressed in an old tweed jacket that looked like it had seen better days, smiling at me warmly. Before I could refuse, he handed the cashier a crumpled bill and turned to me with the strangest smile. "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze piercing and unblinking. I didn't know how to respond, so I just mumbled a thank you and took my coffee, thinking maybe he was just a lonely man trying to make small talk, but something about his eyes followed me even as I walked out of the shop. At first, I shrugged it off, maybe he was just trying to be friendly, a little eccentric, sure, but harmless. But then, as I went about my day, I couldn't shake his words. It was as if they'd woven themselves into my thoughts, resurfacing at the strangest times, his voice echoing in my mind, "Kindness opens doors." It got stranger when I went into the bathroom at work and saw those exact words, "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," written on the mirror in a faint, foggy smudge. I laughed it off, thinking maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe someone else had heard the same line. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the words seemed to haunt me. I started noticing little things. A stranger would smile at me on the subway, or someone would hold the door open just a second too long, staring a little too hard, their expression too intense. The day slipped by in a strange blur of overly kind faces and lingering stares, and by evening, I was starting to feel the weight of it, an itch I couldn't scratch. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the world was pressing in, like every kind act I received had some hidden meaning I couldn't see. It wasn't until I nearly got hit by a car crossing the street that I realized something was really wrong. I hadn't even seen it coming, but just as it barreled toward me, a hand grabbed my arm and yanked me back onto the curb. I turned to thank my rescuer, only to find an old woman smiling at me with the same eerie, knowing expression as the stranger from the coffee shop. "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," she whispered before shuffling away, her gaze lingering on me just a second too long. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding as I watched her disappear into the crowd. At that moment, something clicked, a horrifying realization that maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. The phrase echoed in my mind, growing louder, feeding the paranoia creeping into my bones. I tried to brush it off, tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was horribly wrong. People started acting different around me, like they knew something I didn't, smiling at me with that same unsettling look, muttering the same words under their breath. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but every time I looked around, there they were, strangers, friends, even my own reflection seemed to watch me with that eerie, knowing gaze. I tried calling friends, tried telling them what was happening, but no one took me seriously, chalking it up to stress or lack of sleep. As night fell, I found myself wandering the streets, desperate to escape the invisible weight pressing down on me. I needed answers, needed to find the stranger from the coffee shop and demand he explain what he'd done to me. Somehow, I knew he was the key to all of this, the only one who could make it stop. After hours of searching, I finally spotted him in a dimly lit cafe, sitting alone at a corner table. I stormed up to him, my hands shaking, demanding to know why he'd said those words, why everyone was repeating them, what he'd done to me. He looked up, his eyes calm and cold, and said, "Kindness opens doors no one else can see, but you must be willing to step through." He didn't say anything more, just smiled that strange, empty smile, and in that moment, I realized with a sickening dread that I'd never be free. I was trapped, a puppet to some twisted kindness I didn't understand, doomed to carry his message, to spread his words, to watch that same madness take root in others. As I left the cafe, I found myself repeating his words to a passing stranger, my voice trembling, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as their face shifted, their eyes clouding over with the same haunted look I'd seen in my own. I can't sleep, so I guess I'll share my story. It's about honesty, or at least what happens when you don't practice it. A few months ago, I was living in a sleepy little town that nobody would remember from a postcard. I was just your average guy, working a dead-end job at a convenience store, stuffing my days with mundane routines and my evenings with binge-watching whatever was trending on Netflix. But one dull Thursday evening, my life turned upside down when I met him, an older gentleman, scruffy but sharp-eyed, who walked into the store an hour before closing. My shift was almost over, and I was ready to close up. I quickly scanned him as he wandered through the aisles, picking up random snacks and looking genuinely confused. I could tell he wasn't from around here. He bought an odd mix of chips and a single cold soda. As he approached the counter, I noticed he was holding out something in his hand. It was a glossy card marked with a symbol I couldn't recognize, a circle with intricate patterns. He placed it on the counter, and his voice was gravelly but calm as he asked, "Do you believe in second chances?" He caught me off guard. I replied, "Sure. Why do you ask?" He leaned in closer, and I could smell the combination of fresh air and something else, something ancient, like the earth after a heavy rain. "I have something to show you that might change your perspective on honesty." I couldn't help but feel a shiver creep down my spine. I should have just scanned his items and sent him on his way, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you mean?" I asked. Instead of answering, he pulled a small, frayed notebook out of his jacket pocket, opening to the middle page which was filled with an elegant script. He held it up and said, "This is the Dictionary of Truths. It tells you what honesty looks like, but more importantly, what happens when you lie." I chuckled uncomfortably, thinking this was just some sort of weird prank or sales pitch, but something in his eyes told me he was dead serious. I glanced at the card one last time and shrugged. "Do I get a copy?" I joked. "No, but you're welcome to borrow it," he replied, scribbling his phone number at the bottom of the page. "Call me if you're ever interested." Before I could respond, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving me completely bewildered. For the rest of my shift, that encounter played on loop in my mind. Who was that guy? And what was that notebook? I shook it off, but when I got home, I found myself flipping through the Notes app on my phone, staring at the number he'd given me. I felt like an idiot for even considering calling him. A week passed, and life resumed as normal, but a nagging unease settled in. I wondered about the peculiar old man and his strange proposition. Finally, late one night, I decided to just bite the bullet. I dialed the number, and to my surprise, he answered almost immediately. "You called," he said. His voice was calm but carried a weight to it. "You're interested." "I guess I am," I replied hesitantly. What's this thing about the dictionary of truths? There was a long pause, and just as I was about to hang up, he said, "Meet me at the old oak tree on Maple Street. Midnight tomorrow." The urgency in his voice sent chills down my spine. I didn't know if I should go, but something deep inside urged me to follow through. The next night, I stood beneath the sprawling branches of the oak, my heart racing. The night was eerily silent, and I felt like I was being watched. Suddenly, emerging from the shadows, the old man approached, the same notebook in hand. "Let's begin," he said, flipping the pages until he landed on one with a list titled Consequences of Lies. The words felt heavy, loaded with meanings I couldn't yet grasp. He started recounting stories from the pages, incidents where a small lie spiraled out of control until someone was left destroyed in its wake. One story stuck with me. It was about a family man who had lied about a job. In trying to impress his friends, he claimed he was doing well financially, but when the truth emerged, it shattered his home. The deception led to distrust. The wife left, taking the kids. It sounded like a cliché, but something twisted in my gut told me this wasn't just a story. The old man looked at me and said, "Every lie is a thread, and with enough threads, you weave a tapestry of destruction." I wanted to laugh it off, but as he spoke, I felt that familiar pit forming in my stomach. I walked away that night feeling more confused than enlightened. I didn't want to believe what he was saying, but the ideas clung to me. That next week, I encountered scenarios where dishonesty seemed tempting, like lying to my boss about why I needed a week off or fabricating an excuse to break plans with a friend. Each time, I could hear the old man's voice echoing in my mind, warning me against the consequences. One night, ironically, I was at a bar with friends. They dared me to exaggerate how well things were going in my life just for fun. I was tipsy and felt bold, so I started weaving a tale about a promotion and a new car. I lit up as I shared, feeding off their laughter, but as I spoke, I saw the flicker of concern in the eyes of my childhood friend, Sarah. She knew me better than anyone. The moment the night ended, she pulled me aside. "You're lying, aren't you?" she said softly. A flood of guilt crashed over me. I could have confessed then, but rather, I shrugged and laughed, telling her it was all in good fun. As the days turned into weeks, I felt my act of dishonesty festering. I noticed I was starting to isolate myself from my friends, growing anxious and withdrawn. I ignored Sarah when she reached out. I made excuses. I buried myself in work and avoided social situations. It all came to a head one night when I bumped into the old man again outside the store. His eyes met mine, and I felt a pang of shame. "You've been dishonest," he said, and it wasn't phrased as a question. I stammered, trying to defend myself, but he cut me off. "You're lying to everyone, including yourself. If you don't change, the lies will catch up to you, and they will hurt." I was furious. I felt trapped, his words hanging like an anvil over my head. But deep down, I knew he was right. I walked back home that night, anger morphing into dread. I finally picked up the phone and tried to call Sarah, but what if she didn't want to hear from me? What if I had already ruined things with her? The old man's words haunted me, yet I could feel something breaking open, a crack allowing light to seep through. As I sat in my room, I felt compelled to reach out and tell Sarah the truth about everything I'd been hiding. I stared at the phone, tracing my fingers over the screen, but then doubt swallowed me whole again. The nagging sense of inadequacy surged within me. I could either hold on to the safe illusion I created, my fabricated perfect life, or embrace the fear of vulnerability. That battle went on for weeks until one evening, I found myself in front of my bathroom mirror, shaking. The toll was nearing its breaking point. I felt unworthy of my friendships, convinced they'd all abandon me if they knew who I truly was. That's when I caught a glimpse of the worn pages of that notebook. After days of ignoring it, I finally picked it up from its hiding spot, where I had tossed it. I began flipping through its pages, each one dripping with honest accounts of people who suffered because of lies, the emotional scars that followed them. I felt like I was facing my own shortcomings, each page a reflection of my fears. Tentatively, I dialed Sarah's number, my heart racing in despair as the phone rang. "Hey," she answered, sounding cheerful, but I could hear the hint of caution in her tone when she recognized my voice. "What's up?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I was holding. "Can we talk?" I felt the silence stretch like an eternity before she finally said, "Sure. I'm here." I spilled everything, the lies, my fears, how I felt like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. As I spoke, I felt something shift, a release, a sense of freedom. It felt surreal, like I was shedding skin. She was there, listening, her voice soft and understanding. In that moment, I realized honesty wasn't a weakness, it was a bridge back to my true self. When I finished, there was silence on the other end. My heart raced until she finally whispered, "Thank you for telling me." The relief was palpable, and I could feel bonds reweaving, foundations being rebuilt. It was the hardest conversation I ever had, but I learned that honesty was indeed the hardest thing to face, but it was also the most liberating. After that night, I found myself reaching out to others, mending relationships that had frayed under my web of lies. The old man disappeared from my life, but his words lingered, echoing in my actions. I eventually learned to embrace vulnerability, to show my true self without the masks of deception. So, if you ever find yourself tempted to weave a story that isn't true, just know that honesty can be a hard journey, but the pain of lying is a far greater burden. I wish I could thank that old man, but sometimes I think he was simply a stranger who was meant to guide me through a dark time. So remember this, honesty might not always be easy, but it can set you free in ways you never imagined. I live in a small town, the kind that feels like it's stuck in a time capsule. The sort of place where everyone knows each other, and we like it that way. Every year, we organize a community event, the Harvest Festival. It's meant to celebrate the season, promote local businesses, and bring the community together, but this year felt different. There was an unsettling vibe that lingered as we began to plan. I had volunteered to help wrangle the logistics, thinking it would be a great opportunity to bond with neighbors and share ideas. Little did I know, what started as a simple organizing task would spiral into a terrifying experience that I still can't shake off. The first few meetings were typical, people tossing around ideas, kids' activities, local music, and food vendors. We all gathered in the town hall, an old brick building that always felt like it was whispering secrets from the past. It wasn't until the third meeting that I noticed her, an elderly woman sitting in the back, her face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat and a thick shawl. She never spoke, just stared, and long after the meetings ended, she lingered outside as others left, her eyes boring into us like she was watching something we couldn't see. At first, I dismissed her presence as the quirks of our small town, but my gut told me something was off. I decided to find out who she was. Speaking to a few of the old-timers in town, I learned her name was Agnes. No one mentioned her too often, it would drift faintly in the air when someone recounted how she'd been a local herbalist before abruptly disappearing years ago. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had some connection to our festival. One night, I found myself restless, sprawled on my couch, the faint glow of my laptop illuminating the room. An obsession grasped me as I delved into Agnes's past. I stumbled across old newspaper clippings, stories about strange occurrences at past harvest festivals. Townsfolk spoke of her in the most peculiar ways, alluding to curses and dark rituals. Was she somehow linked to the festival? I put the pieces together in a manner that felt nonsensical. Perhaps it was just a small-town legend blown out of proportion. As the event date pushed closer, the tasks piled. It was during one of those late nights spent preparing that I received a phone call from the committee chair, urging a last-minute meeting. The atmosphere grew increasingly charged. The discussions turned frantic, many expressed worries that this festival would be like those of the past, haunted by misfortunes. I shared what I found about Agnes, half expecting laughter but receiving tight-lipped stares. They spoke in hushed tones, and a wave of unease washed over the room. With every passing day, I felt the presence of Agnes grow. I saw her often, always lurking at the edges of town, her eyes shadowed under that broad-brimmed hat. One evening, driven by a mix of dread and curiosity, I decided to confront her. Surprisingly, she welcomed me among her herbs and curious knickknacks, her small cottage an explosion of dust and color. I asked about the festival and its history, feeling foolish as I recounted the town's suspicions. To my shock, Agnes didn't dismiss me. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the festival's origins, how it once honored the earth, but a long-forgotten wrong twisted it into something sinister. She warned that the festival shouldn't just be a celebration but a ritual of appeasement for those who'd been wronged. Those who dismissed her words, she said, would soon regret it. I left her cottage unsettled. I couldn't bring any of this up at the next meeting, they'd already labeled me as paranoid. Yet, as the festival neared, accidents began to occur. One vendor's truck broke down en route, another's tent collapsed the night before the festival, and an unexplained illness swept through the children participating in the events. Whispers began to circle about Agnes again, wrapping those superstitions tighter around the town like a noose. The day of the festival arrived, and we hustled to set up booths, decorations fluttering against the wind, laughter rising like smoke into the crisp autumn air. I was lost among the chaos when I felt a chill pierce through me. I glanced up to find Agnes standing amidst the gathering crowd, her eyes locked onto me. For a moment, time stood still, and I could have sworn there was a sigh from the earth itself. The day unfolded beautifully despite the strange illnesses and accidents, the townsfolk thankfully distracted. But as dusk fell, festivities ebbed into shadows, and an uneasy tension hung thick in the air. As the sun set, the bonfire blazed, and we gathered for the traditional telling of ghost stories. Then, just as a local man began an especially eerie tale, a story of betrayal and revenge, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. It came from the direction of the food stall. Everyone ran, and I was propelled along with the wave. There amidst the scattered booths lay an overturned pot, its contents boiling and bubbling in a way that was unnatural. The festival sweet corn had been mixed with something dark and sticky, a grotesque blend of tar. Panic washed over the crowd as we stumbled back. And then, amidst the chaos, I looked over to see Agnes, her face twisted into an expression of raw, unyielding rage. She raised her arms to the sky, the shadows around her growing long and sinister, as if drawing in the dark corners of the night itself. "You've defiled the earth," she howled, a sound that twisted my insides. "This rite can only be undone with blood." I felt my heart race as the crowd began to disperse, screams echoing through the panic. A small group of us stood there, frozen, paralyzed by her words. I mouthed at my friends to run, but as I turned back, I realized Agnes was now pointing directly at me. "It's you who must sacrifice what you love most. Or, this town will face ruin." The urgency in her voice resonated. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon, darkness draping us like a shroud. My heart sank. What did she mean? I saw my little sister, who'd been helping with the family booth, lost and confused among the chaos. In that instant, I realized Agnes's warning was not just a myth, it was real. I had to act. I screamed for everyone to run, knowing I wouldn't forgive myself if something happened to her. Gathering every ounce of courage, I ran toward the chaos, the thrumming energy in my chest pulsating with dread. Just as my sister reached the edge of the terror, I snatched her hand and sprinted from the festival, the dark echoes of Agnes haunting me every step of the way. Later, as the town attempted to pull together the pieces of that night, I heard the whispers. The children's illnesses were linked to age-old grievances of the town, their suffering a payment for years of disrespect toward the land. As for Agnes, she vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. To this day, no one dares to mention her name aloud. We tried to carry on, but the festival has never been the same. The townsfolk refer to it now as a cautionary tale. The following year, it was decided without much mention, no more harvest festival. All I can do is wonder, did we earn our punishment through ignorance? That haunting night still grips me, reminding me each day of the web woven in secrets and the cost of our inattention. The knowledge that sometimes the past doesn't remain buried, and that the world watches, waiting for us to restore the balance we so carelessly disrupted. I can't sleep. It's been days, and I'm not sure how long I can keep this up. I've spent almost that entire time staring at the same patch of dirt in my backyard, waiting for something I can't explain. You might think I'm losing it, but that patch of dirt is where my patience was tested, and it's where I finally learned its true value. Let me take you back a couple of weeks. I was at a low point in my life. Just lost my job, moving back in with my parents because I couldn't afford rent, and every rejection email felt like a knife to my already wounded pride. While everyone around me was busy with their lives, I felt like I was just floating, unwanted and useless. In my despair, I sought solace in gardening. My mom was big on having a beautiful yard and insisted that I join her in tending to it. At first, I scoffed at the idea, rolling my eyes at the triviality of planting flowers and watering plants. But she was determined, convinced that getting my hands dirty could clear the clutter in my mind. So, I went along with it. We started with a small vegetable garden, a few tomato plants, some cucumbers, and a handful of herbs. As I dug in the dirt, planting seeds and fussing over weeds, I began to feel something. It was as if every time my hands sank into that soil, a little bit of the weight I was carrying lifted. I never thought I'd find comfort in something so mundane, but the more I planted, the more I realized that growth took time and care. So I kept tending to the garden every day, figuring I'd at least put my time to good use and hopefully reap some rewards. But I was impatient. The first few days, I watered the plants obsessively, staring at the ground, willing them to sprout. I became a little too invested, pacing back and forth, glaring at the dirt like it owed me an explanation. Days dragged on, and nothing happened. No little green shoots poking through the soil, not even a sprout. In my frustration, I Googled ways to grow plants faster. Maybe I was doing something wrong. I sought out every gardening forum, every hack, every tip. But despite the well-intentioned advice, my plants seemed to mock me, staying stubbornly dormant. I began to feel the familiar sting of hopelessness, almost like a cruel joke had been played on me. One particularly restless night, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to dig up one of the seeds I had planted, just to see what was going on beneath the surface. As I clumsily clawed the dirt apart, I felt it, something hard and firm. My heart raced as I dug deeper, revealing a small, malformed seedling, barely alive and shriveled. Inexplicably, I felt a rush of guilt wash over me. I had been so obsessed with immediate results that I had neglected the natural process of growth. In that moment, I realized that all good things take time and, more importantly, that forcing something to happen before it's ready often leads to destruction. I carefully covered the little seedling back up and left it alone. From that day on, I resolved to be patient. Instead of rushing into the garden expecting immediate gratification, I allowed the plants to grow at their own pace. I learned to trust the process of life, of patience becoming a critical part of nurturing growth. Each time I watered the plants, I took my time, and slowly but surely, my garden started to flourish. Tiny green leaves emerged from the earth, reaching for the sun. It was mesmerizing. I found myself smiling at the progress, an overwhelming sense of joy mingled with relief. My days began to fill with purpose, waking up early to care for the plants and marvel at the transformation. The garden became my sanctuary, a space I could lose myself in, and I found it increasingly easier to forget about the chaos swarming around me. I also started applying this newfound patience to other areas of my life. I stopped rushing my job hunt, began networking, and discovered I had more to offer once I wasn't desperate for anything to come my way. I realized the waiting wasn't a waste of time, rather, it was an opportunity to truly understand myself better. Weeks passed, and as my garden blossomed, so did I. I became more confident, and surprisingly, I gained a job interview. Finally, I had something to show for my hard work. Before the interview, I went outside to check on my plants, remembering how far I had come in this journey. I felt invincible, a hint of pride swelling in my chest as I admired the rows of greens that surrounded me. I nailed the interview, and just a few days later, I received the job offer I had been dreaming of. But that victory came at a price. The day after I accepted the offer, I rushed to the garden, eager to tell my plants about my success. But when I stepped outside, the air grew unnaturally still. Something felt off. To my horror, my once thriving garden was now decimated. Every plant, every seedling I had nurtured with care was wilted, lifeless, reduced to a barren patch of dirt. I stumbled backward in shock as despair flooded over me. It was as if nature itself was punishing me for my arrogance. I had learned my lesson, but now it mocked me. I ripped up the weeds more furiously than before, tearing at the earth as if rage could compel something to grow from the remnants of my efforts. And there it was, that shriveled seedling, still there, fighting for life among the devastation. It was weak, but it wasn't dead. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for the right moment. I knelt by the dirt and began to care for it again, cradling that fragile sprout in my hands and whispering gentle encouragements. In the following days, I returned to that same spot, watering it and shielding it from the harsh elements. I began to see some life in it again. Maybe, just maybe, I could help it grow stronger this time, providing it with the patience it needed to flourish. And as I waited, I recognized that this patch of dirt wasn't just about the plants anymore. It was about me. They had taught me something invaluable. Time is not a wasted luxury, but a necessary element in the delicate dance of growth. Now, I sit here, staring at this patch of dirt, aware that patience is no longer just a lesson but a part of me. Even if the world around me continues to spin in relentless chaos, I have learned to let go of the need for instant results. The value of waiting, of nurturing growth, is something deeper than I could have ever imagined. I still can't sleep most nights, but I find comfort knowing that as I wait, life continues to unfold, slowly but surely, whether I'm ready for it or not. And so here I am, waiting again, but this time, it's different. This time, I hold hope tightly in my hands, just like that fragile seedling, and I will nurture it until it blooms. I encourage everyone out there to find their patch of dirt, whether it be literal or metaphorical, and learn the value of waiting patiently. Because there's magic in the calm before the storm, in the persistence of growth, and in the understanding that life isn't just a race, it's a journey worth taking, one moment at a time. The surprise party that went hilariously wrong. It was supposed to be the surprise party of the year. I had been planning it for weeks, carefully orchestrating every detail to ensure it would be perfect. My best friend, Sarah, had recently been going through a rough patch in her life, and I thought a surprise party would be the perfect way to lift her spirits. We had always been the type to throw wild, over-the-top parties, but this time, I wanted to go all out. I had rented a fancy venue, hired a DJ, and even ordered a cake that was shaped like her favorite animal, a panda. The plan was simple. Sarah would think she was going to a casual dinner with a few friends, but when she walked into the venue, she would be greeted by a room full of people shouting, "Surprise!" It was going to be amazing. The day of the party arrived, and I was feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. I had spent the entire day decorating the venue with streamers, balloons, and a massive banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Sarah." The staff at the venue were incredibly helpful, and everything was going according to plan. I even had her favorite playlist queued up, ready to blast the moment she stepped through the door. I had everything under control. Or so I thought. Around 6 p.m., Sarah texted me, saying she was on her way. My heart skipped a beat. The moment was finally here. I quickly gathered everyone who had been hiding in the back room and told them to get ready for the big reveal. As the lights dimmed, everyone shuffled into position, and we waited in anticipation. The moment I had been waiting for had arrived. My phone buzzed again. Sarah was here. The door swung open, and the first thing I saw was her face. The look of confusion on her face was immediate. It wasn't the excitement I had expected. She looked around the room, her eyes darting between all the smiling faces, trying to figure out what was happening. "Surprise!" everyone yelled, but Sarah didn't react the way I had hoped. She stood frozen in the doorway, looking like a deer caught in headlights. It was as though she had no idea what was going on. And then, it happened. A loud crash echoed through the room, and the cake, the beautiful panda-shaped cake, toppled off the table and onto the floor. The room fell silent. There was a collective gasp as the once perfect cake splattered across the floor in a mess of frosting and fondant. It was like a scene from a nightmare. I froze, unable to process what had just happened. The cake was ruined. Sarah's eyes widened in horror, but not at the cake. She looked around at all of us, and then at the massive banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Sarah." The confusion on her face deepened. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. My heart sank. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The entire room had been filled with people who were all there to celebrate her, but Sarah was standing there, completely overwhelmed. She hadn't known it was her birthday party. She had no idea. She wasn't expecting anything, and she certainly wasn't ready for this. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had completely messed up. I had gotten so wrapped up in making the party perfect that I hadn't taken a moment to actually ask Sarah what she wanted. I had planned everything without consulting her, assuming she would love it. But in reality, she wasn't in the mood for a huge celebration. She hadn't been in the mood for anything, really. It was then that I noticed the exhaustion in her eyes. She had been dealing with a difficult breakup and had been keeping it to herself for weeks. She had told me she wasn't ready to celebrate anything, and yet here I was, forcing a party upon her that she didn't want. She wasn't angry, she was just confused. She didn't know how to react. I felt my face go hot with embarrassment as I tried to salvage the situation. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," I said, rushing over to her. "I thought you'd love it. I just wanted to do something nice." But she just looked at me with a faint smile and shook her head. "It's okay, really. "I just didn't expect this," she said, her voice quiet. At that moment, the DJ, who had been sitting awkwardly in the corner, unsure of what to do, decided to play the first song on the playlist. The upbeat music filled the room, and it only made the awkwardness more palpable. Sarah turned to me, her expression softening. "I appreciate the effort," she said, "but I think this is a little too much for me right now." I felt my stomach churn with regret. But before I could say anything else, one of the guests, a well-meaning but overly enthusiastic friend of Sarah's, tried to lighten the mood by grabbing the microphone and shouting, "Let's do some karaoke." The problem was, this particular friend was tone-deaf, and the song choice was "I Will Survive" by Gloria Gaynor. The karaoke machine screeched as the first note played, and the friend began singing with all the confidence of a pop star. The song was horribly off-key, and it only added to the chaos of the situation. It was like a bad comedy sketch unfolding in real time. People started to laugh, but it wasn't the happy, celebratory laughter I had imagined. It was nervous laughter, the kind that comes when everyone knows something is going wrong but nobody knows how to fix it. To make matters worse, someone had accidentally spilled their drink on the dance floor, and a huge puddle formed right near the cake wreckage. People were slipping and sliding as they tried to avoid the growing mess. It was a disaster. The night went from bad to worse, and I watched as people began to leave early, not wanting to be part of the disaster anymore. Sarah, too, seemed to be slowly retreating into herself, quietly slipping away from the crowd. I tried to make amends, but nothing I did could change the fact that the party had been a complete failure. By the time the last few guests had trickled out, I was left standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of my failed surprise. The cake was ruined, the karaoke machine was still playing off-key renditions of "I Will Survive," and Sarah was gone. I sat there, exhausted, defeated, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. But then, as I was cleaning up the mess, I received a text from Sarah. "I'm sorry for the way I reacted. I just wasn't in the right headspace for a big party. But I appreciate that you tried, and I'm lucky to have a friend like you." I stared at the message, feeling a little relieved. Maybe the party had been a disaster, but I hadn't completely failed. At least, I hoped. As I hit send to respond, I promised myself I would never try to plan a surprise party again. Not without actually talking to the person first. It's funny how sometimes, the best intentions can lead to the worst results. But in the end, I learned a valuable lesson: no matter how much you try to do something nice, it's the thought that counts, and sometimes, the thought should have been to ask the other person if they even wanted it. I'll never forget the day I learned to embrace my quirks. It started like any ordinary Wednesday, but that afternoon would reveal the bizarre world that lurked just beneath the surface of my reality. As an introverted high school junior, I often found solace in the odd little habits I'd picked up over the years, like counting the number of steps it took to get from my locker to my classroom or reciting the names of all the U.S. presidents backward whenever I felt nervous. My friends thought it was weird, they'd chuckle and suggest I lay off the caffeine. I just shrugged it off and kept doing my thing. That day after school, I took my usual route home through the woods that brushed against the edge of our small town. Those woods had always felt like an escape, a fortress of silence where I could lose myself in thoughts without judgment. But something was different that day. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I noticed a faint rustling off the path, but the curiosity I typically had turned to caution. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about turning back home and burying myself under my comforter. Instead, I pressed on, the allure of the unknown outweighing my anxiety. As I walked deeper into the woods, I heard whispers. They were faint at first, like the crackling of dry leaves, but soon they grew clearer, turning into distinct voices. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart raced as I tried to make out the words. They were chanting something. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something inexplicable kept my feet glued to the ground. I stepped closer, peering through a thicket of branches. And there they were, a group of kids from my school, seated in a circle, their eyes closed, hands clasped together as they swayed. I recognized a few of them: Jamie, with his messy hair, and Sarah, always wearing bright colors. The last member of the group was the mysterious new kid, Max. He was the subject of a lot of whispers, an enigma with a strange aura that seemed to pull people in. I'd heard rumors about him being into weird rituals, and here they were, in the middle of the woods, looking like they were casting some sort of spell. My heart raced, fear mixing with intrigue. That was when I felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of my mind, like a spark igniting something deep within me. In a strange twist, I felt compelled to let go of my reservations. I had never been a part of anything like this, always the awkward outsider, but an overwhelming urge to join them surged through me. I silently stepped through the brush and into their circle, drawn in as if by a magnetic force. They didn't seem to notice me at first, but as I settled down in the grass, I felt a strange warmth envelop me. I sat cross-legged among them, trying to blend in while my pulse raced. Max opened his eyes and glanced in my direction, a smirk creeping onto his face as if he had been expecting me. "Welcome to the awareness circle," he said, his voice smooth like melting honey. That's when I realized I had done something that seemed completely illogical. I had joined a commune of misfits, embracing a bizarre yet thrilling opportunity. Whatever this was, it felt electric. The others didn't mind my presence, but their focus was now on me. They invited me to share my quirks, something I would typically deny doing. When it was my turn, I hesitated, my throat tightening. I felt the weight of judgment before the words even left my mouth. But then the feeling that had brought me there surged through me again, reminding me that I could share without fear. I count everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Steps, syllables, even breaths sometimes. A soft giggle escaped Jamie's lips, but Max shot him a look that silenced him. "That's great," he said, impatience giving way to curiosity. "No one's perfect. We all have our quirks. That's what makes us unique. Now, how do you feel when you do it?" I felt the rush of warm confidence crash over me. "Safe," I admitted. "Like I'm in control." The group nodded, and then they began sharing their own eccentricities, Jamie's fixation on collecting rocks shaped like animals, Sarah's obsession with memorizing every single Pokémon, and even Max's fondness for talking to inanimate objects as if they were alive. As each unique quirk was shared, a wave of acceptance washed over the group. In that sacred space surrounded by the trees, I felt a tether of camaraderie strengthen between us. We were bonded in our peculiarities, all of the things we were taught to hide suddenly becoming treasures to be celebrated. I could feel the air humming with energy, excitement dancing in the atmosphere. But the whispers returned, bolstered now by our openness. They seemed to wrap around us, urging us deeper into the experience. I closed my eyes and swayed gently with the others, allowing the rhythm to pull me in. Something began to happen. I felt an uncanny connection to the woods, an awakening of sorts. The world around us shifted, glimmers of light beginning to swirl through the foliage. The whispers grew louder, intertwining with our laughter and stories, transcending into something sacred. And then I caught sight of a figure in the distance, a silhouette appearing between the trees, ethereal and beautiful, trailing wisps of light. It resembled a person, but it was clear that it wasn't. The figure beckoned us closer. My heart raced, questions flooded my mind, but I felt compelled to follow, just as the others did. As we approached, the air shimmered with an indescribable light, and with it came a sense of acceptance, a feeling of being seen for who we really were. Standing there, I realized that all our quirks, the counting, the collections, the odd conversations, were threads woven into a beautiful tapestry of individuality. The figure hovered before us, a shape shifting and turning, granting us a glimpse of the truest versions of ourselves. I felt empowered, joyous, each quirk a piece of a puzzle we were finally assembling. The woods pulsated with life, and as we took a collective breath in unison, the figure smiled, and for a moment, I thought I could feel it inside me, an acceptance that dared to exist unapologetically in the world. The moment shattered like glass, and with it, we were thrown from the vision. The figure dissolved into the mist, leaving the woods condensed around us, still and quiet as if nothing had ever happened. It was just us, an ordinary group of misfit high school kids in the woods, yet we carried something that ordinary eyes would never see. As we parted ways that evening, our hearts full, I knew I would never again cower in silence. My quirks were no longer something to hide. They were embraced, celebrated, and empowered. And somehow I got the sense that the magic of that day, of reckoning with who we truly were, lived on, echoing in the whispers of the woods, waiting for anyone brave enough to join. From that day forward, the woods became my second home, a sanctuary to ignite my uniqueness as I made my way through life, quirks and all, finally confident in the realization that it wasn't just okay to be different, it was extraordinary. Aita for refusing to babysit for my rich sister without payment. It all started when my sister, Claire, called me out of the blue, sounding frantic. She and her husband, Tom, had a fancy gala to attend, and they needed a last-minute babysitter for their two kids, Noah and Mia. I could already hear the stress in her voice as she explained how they couldn't find anyone else. I considered it for a moment. After all, I love my niece and nephew, and they were usually a joy to be around. But then I remembered how Claire had always treated me like I was beneath her. She and Tom were wealthy, living in a sprawling mansion in an affluent neighborhood, while I was still renting a small apartment, struggling to make ends meet with my job as a graphic designer. They often flaunted their lifestyle, posting on social media about their extravagant vacations and designer clothes, while I had to watch my budget carefully. I hesitated, but the thought of my sister's desperation tugged at my heartstrings. I agreed to babysit, but I made it clear that I expected some form of compensation. "Claire, I'll help you out, but I think it's fair if you pay me something for the evening." "You know how busy I am," I said, trying to keep my tone light. There was a pause on the line, and then she let out a huff of frustration. "Really? You're going to make this about money? I thought we were family," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with disdain. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "It's not about that. I just think it's fair, especially since you guys can afford it," Claire sighed, and I could almost see her rolling her eyes. "Fine, I'll give you $100. Just be here by 6, she said reluctantly. I agreed, and as the day approached, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. On the evening of the gala, I arrived at Claire's house, and it was even more extravagant than I remembered. The kids were already in their pajamas, and Claire was frantically trying to finish getting ready. "Thanks for coming on such short notice," she said, shoving $100 bill into my hand without making eye contact. I smiled and took it, trying not to think about how awkward this situation felt. "No problem, I'm happy to help." The night went surprisingly well. Noah and Mia were excited to see me, and we spent the evening playing games and watching cartoons. But as the night wore on, I found myself reflecting on the disparity between our lives. The kids were adorable, but I felt a twinge of resentment as I remembered the times Claire had belittled my financial situation. By the time Tom and Claire returned home, I was exhausted but felt proud of the evening we had spent together. I expected them to thank me, but when they walked in, Claire's first words were about how much fun they had at the gala. "Did the kids behave?" she asked, barely glancing my way. "Yeah, they were great," I replied, a bit deflated. I really enjoyed spending time with them. Claire waved her hand dismissively, still focused on Tom as they recounted their evening. I felt invisible, my presence hardly acknowledged. After a few minutes, they finally turned their attention back to me, and I decided it was time to address the payment. "So, about that $100, I started, but Claire interrupted me. "Oh, right, here you go," she said, pulling out a crumpled bill from her purse. "Thanks for taking care of them." I felt a rush of irritation as I took the money. I really appreciate it, but I was hoping for a little more. This was a long night. Claire's expression shifted. "You're seriously going to ask for more money? I thought we were family. You should be grateful I even offered you anything." My heart raced as I tried to stay calm. "I just think it's fair to value my time and effort. I could have spent my evening working on my projects." The tension in the room thickened, and Tom chimed in, his voice defensive. "You knew what you were getting into. You should be thankful for the opportunity to spend time with your niece and nephew. It's not like we asked you to babysit every week." I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, their judgment weighing down on me. "I am grateful, but it's a job nonetheless. Just because you have money doesn't mean you can undervalue my time," I shot back, my frustration bubbling over. Claire crossed her arms, a look of disdain plastered across her face. "Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with money, you'd appreciate what family means," she retorted. "You know, not everything is about financial compensation. Some things should come from the heart." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "I understand that, but I also work hard for my money. I can't just drop everything whenever you ask me to, and I think it's reasonable to expect to be compensated for my time." Claire scoffed, and the tension grew thicker. "So you're telling me that you're willing to let money ruin your relationship with your family?" I felt my stomach drop. "It's not about ruining relationships, Claire. It's about recognizing that my time is valuable too." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "If you want me to babysit again, we need to discuss payment first. It's that simple." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken resentment. Whatever. If you're going to be this way, I don't need your help, Claire finally said, her voice cold. I can find someone else who isn't so focused on money. Good luck finding someone who cares about your kids as much as I do, I shot back, my voice sharper than intended. I stormed out of the house, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. The drive home was a blur, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let my sister's wealth and privilege get under my skin. As days turned into weeks, I struggled with the fallout. I didn't hear from Claire, and I felt torn. Was I wrong for wanting to be paid? A few weeks later, I found myself scrolling through social media, only to stumble upon a post from Claire. It was a picture of her family at a lavish vacation, captioned with how blessed they were to have each other. The comments were filled with praises about how wonderful they were. I felt a sharp pang of jealousy but also a tinge of relief that I had stood my ground. I spent the night thinking about my relationship with my sister. Should I reach out and apologize, or should I stick to my guns? I confided in a friend who suggested I let the dust settle. Family dynamics are complicated. Sometimes giving them space is the best thing, she said, and I took her advice. Weeks passed, and eventually, I received a text from Claire. Can we talk? It read, and I felt a rush of anxiety. I agreed to meet her for coffee, and as I sat across from her at the cafe, I couldn't help but notice how different she looked. There was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. I'm sorry about how things went down, she started, her voice softer than I expected. I didn't mean to make it sound like I didn't appreciate your help. I felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you. I just wanted to feel valued too, I replied, trying to keep my emotions in check. Claire nodded, a hint of understanding in her eyes. I realize now that I took you for granted. I'm sorry if I made you feel like you weren't important. I just got caught up in the moment. We spent the next hour discussing everything from family to finances, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Claire admitted that her wealth sometimes created barriers between us, and I shared how it had made me feel small and undervalued. By the end of our conversation, we had reached an understanding. I'd still love for you to babysit when I need help, and I promise to pay you what's fair, she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. And I'll make sure to respect your time more. I smiled back, feeling lighter. I'd like that. As I left the cafe, I realized that standing up for myself had created an opportunity for growth in our relationship. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about respect and understanding. Aita for refusing to babysit without payment? Maybe I was a little, but sometimes, standing my ground had brought us closer together. The drama unfolded at my family reunion. Here's what happened. It was supposed to be a typical family reunion, one of those laid-back affairs where we all gathered at my aunt's house, caught up on each other's lives, and indulged in the same tired old jokes and anecdotes we'd heard 1,000 times before. Every year, my extended family would gather, most of them from out of town, for a weekend of barbecues, games, and a lot of awkward small talk. But this year was different. Something was off. I could feel it the moment I walked in the door. There was a tension in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was there, like a cloud hanging over the usual light-hearted chaos. It wasn't long before I found out exactly what had been building up in the weeks leading up to the reunion. It all started with my cousin, Hannah. She had been acting strangely for months, withdrawing from the family, avoiding group chats, and generally keeping to herself. I figured she was just going through a phase, maybe some personal stuff she didn't want to share, but I had no idea what was really going on. The moment she arrived at the reunion, she seemed even more distant than usual. She wasn't her bubbly, sarcastic self, she was quieter, almost nervous. Her eyes darted around the room as if she was searching for something, or someone. That's when I noticed him. Eric, her ex-boyfriend, had shown up too, despite the fact that their breakup had been nothing short of dramatic. They had been together for nearly 5 years, and everyone had thought they were the perfect couple, until the explosive breakup that had torn the family apart. I hadn't seen Eric in months, but here he was, standing in the corner, looking just as uncomfortable as everyone else. It was clear he wasn't welcome, not after the way things had ended between him and Hannah. The breakup had been messy. He'd cheated on her, or at least that's what she had said, and the fallout had been brutal. Hannah had cut him off completely, but somehow, he had wormed his way back into the family's good graces. That's when the whispers started. Aunt Linda, who always had a way of getting the juiciest gossip, pulled me aside and whispered in my ear that Eric had been acting strange lately, coming around asking for forgiveness, trying to win back Hannah. But the worst part? He wasn't just asking for her forgiveness, he was asking for a second chance. As the day went on, the tension only grew. People avoided each other's eyes, conversations died as soon as they began, and even the kids seemed to feel it. We all tried to pretend everything was fine, but it was impossible to ignore the elephant in the room. I caught snippets of conversations, bits of gossip that filled in the gaps. Apparently, Hannah had been seeing someone new, someone she'd been keeping quiet about. She hadn't told anyone the details, but the rumors were flying fast. Some said he was a wealthy businessman, others said he was a childhood friend, but no one knew for sure. What was clear, however, was that Hannah was still deeply hurt by Eric's betrayal, but she was trying to move on. As the evening wore on, things finally came to a head. We were all gathered in the backyard, just finishing up dinner, when Hannah and Eric were both standing at the grill at the same time, awkwardly side by side. That's when Eric made his move. He stepped up to her, his voice low but steady, and said, "Hannah, I know I messed up. I'm sorry. I've changed. I know you don't believe me, but I've been working on myself. Can we please talk?" Hannah froze. The air seemed to thicken as everyone around the grill held their breath, waiting for her response. For a moment, it seemed like she might actually listen to him, and I could feel the pit in my stomach growing. She hadn't spoken to him in months, this wasn't the time or the place for him to be making this kind of move. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with something I couldn't read, and then she said, "You don't get to do this. Not here. Not now. You don't get to come back into my life just because you think you've learned a lesson." There was a pause, and then she added, "I'm happy now, Eric. And you don't get to ruin that." Her words were like a slap in the face, loud and clear enough for everyone to hear. Eric stood there, frozen, his face turning red with embarrassment. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the realization that Hannah wasn't going to forgive him, that he had no place in her life anymore. But that wasn't the end of it. As if things couldn't get worse, out of nowhere, someone yelled, "What about the new guy, huh? Is that what this is all about?" It was my cousin Jason, always the troublemaker, and the room fell silent as he stood up, pointing his finger at Hannah. "You're just going to forget everything Eric did for some guy we've never even met?" I couldn't believe it. Jason was known for stirring up drama, but this was crossing a line. The whole family was now caught in the crossfire, all eyes on Hannah and Eric, waiting for the next move. Hannah, clearly done with the conversation, snapped back, "You have no idea what's going on, Jason. You don't get to judge me. You don't know what it's like to be lied to and cheated on. So, keep your opinions to yourself." I could feel the heat building, the tension thickening, but the worst was yet to come. Just as I thought the situation was finally starting to simmer down, another cousin, Mark, chimed in. "Well, if Eric's out, then what about me? I was there for you when you were with him. And now you're just going to throw all that away for some stranger?" And that was it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Eric snapped. "You think I'm some kind of joke? You think I'm just going to sit here and take this?" He turned on Mark, his voice rising with anger. "I made mistakes, yeah, but I'm trying to fix things. I'm trying to make up for it, and you all just want to make me feel like garbage." The argument escalated quickly from there. Everyone started shouting, cousins yelling at cousins, aunts and uncles trying to play peacemakers, but it was all a mess. People were storming off, fighting, crying, and I could barely process it all. I didn't know who was right, who was wrong, but it didn't matter anymore. The reunion, which had started as a chance to reconnect, had turned into a battlefield. The next morning, things were eerily quiet. The usual post-reunion cleanup was happening, but the energy had shifted. People avoided eye contact, some left early, others stayed behind to talk in hushed tones. It was a family reunion that had turned into a family crisis. I don't know what happened after that, whether things ever got resolved, or if the rift between Eric and Hannah was ever healed. But I knew one thing for sure, things would never be the same again. The drama that unfolded at my family reunion wasn't just a one-time thing. It left scars, deep ones that would take years to heal, and no matter how much time passed, we would all remember that one day when everything fell apart. The Gift That Ruined Christmas, A Family Feud. The Gift That Ruined Christmas, A Family Feud. The Christmas I'll never forget started with the best of intentions, as these things often do, and spiraled into something I couldn't have imagined even in my worst holiday nightmares. It had always been a sacred tradition in our family to gather at my grandparents' house every year, no matter the weather, no matter how far we had to travel. The air would be filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, the halls decorated with garlands and fairy lights, and the living room practically bursting with presents under the enormous tree. My grandmother, ever the meticulous hostess, ensured everything ran smoothly, from the perfectly cooked Christmas ham to the carefully orchestrated gift exchange. But that year, a single present managed to unravel decades of tradition and harmony, sparking a feud that tore through our family like a raging wildfire. It began innocently enough. We were all gathered around the tree, sipping on eggnog and laughing at Uncle Joe's terrible dad jokes, when my cousin Emily handed out the last gift. It was a small, tastefully wrapped box, and it had my Uncle Greg's name on it. Emily, ever the prankster, flashed a mischievous grin as she passed it to him. Everyone leaned in, intrigued, expecting another one of her infamous joke gifts. Uncle Greg raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. He carefully peeled away the wrapping paper, revealing a sleek black box. His eyes widened when he saw the name on the lid, Heritage DNA. "You didn't," he said, half amused, half nervous. Emily giggled. "I did. Come on, you've been talking about wanting to trace our roots for ages. Now you can do it." The room buzzed with laughter and chatter, everyone speculating about what Uncle Greg's ancestry results might reveal. But beneath the surface, something shifted. My dad's face grew pale, and I noticed my grandmother's smile tighten, the joy draining from her eyes. At the time, I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to the general chaos of Christmas morning. But the tension that settled over the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Uncle Greg chuckled awkwardly, putting the box aside. "Thanks, Emily. I'll, definitely check it out later," he said, but the way his voice wavered made my stomach knot. For a moment, the festivities resumed, though with an odd undercurrent of unease. But when my grandmother suddenly excused herself and disappeared into the kitchen, my dad followed her, his brow furrowed with concern. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if we should intervene or pretend nothing was wrong. Being the nosy person I am, I decided to investigate. I quietly made my way to the kitchen, careful not to draw attention to myself, and listened in on their hushed conversation. "How could she do this?" my grandmother was saying, her voice cracking. "After everything we've worked to keep hidden." "Mom, calm down," my dad whispered, though he sounded anything but calm. "We don't even know if he'll go through with it. It might mean nothing. Or it could mean everything," my grandmother snapped. "Our whole family. It could all come crashing down." My heart raced, and I stepped back, trying to process what I'd just overheard. Hidden secrets. A family history they were desperate to keep buried? It was like something out of a soap opera, but this was real, and it was happening right in front of me. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had grown even frostier. Uncle Greg, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the kitchen, was laughing with my aunts and uncles, but it felt forced, like everyone was trying too hard to maintain the facade of Christmas cheer. Later that evening, after dinner, the tension boiled over. My dad pulled Uncle Greg aside, and I saw them talking in the corner, their voices growing louder with each passing minute. "Just don't do it," my dad was saying, his voice tinged with desperation. "You don't know what you're getting into." Uncle Greg's face darkened. "What's your problem?" he snapped. "It's a harmless test. I just want to know where we come from. Why are you acting so weird?" My dad's jaw clenched, and he glanced nervously around the room, where the rest of the family was pretending not to listen. "It's not harmless," he hissed. "There are things better left buried." The room fell silent, all eyes on the two of them. Emily, looking horrified, tried to interject. "Guys, I didn't mean to start anything. It was just a gift, for fun." But my dad wasn't listening. "You have no idea what kind of damage this could do," he said, his voice breaking. Uncle Greg glared at him, his fists clenched. "What are you so afraid of?" he demanded. "What are you hiding?" And then, to everyone's shock, my grandmother stormed into the room, her face pale and eyes blazing. "Enough," she shouted, her voice trembling with anger and something that looked like fear. If you must know the truth, then fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the youngest kids, who had been playing with their new toys, stopped and stared. My grandmother took a deep breath, and I could see the weight of whatever secret she was about to reveal pressing down on her. Years ago, she began, her voice wavering, before any of you were born, there was a situation. A mistake, one that could have ruined us. We thought we'd put it behind us, but this DNA test. It could bring everything back. My heart pounded as she went on, detailing a sordid story of an affair, a hidden pregnancy, and a family cover-up that sounded like something out of a crime novel. Apparently, one of our uncles, an uncle we'd grown up with, loved, and called family, might not be related to us by blood. The details were hazy, and she clearly left out parts she couldn't bear to say out loud, but the damage was done. The room erupted into chaos. Accusations were hurled, tears were shed, and the warm glow of Christmas had been extinguished, replaced by a bitter, icy storm of betrayal. Emily was sobbing, blaming herself for the fallout, while Uncle Greg sat in stunned silence, clutching the DNA kit like it was a grenade that had just gone off in his hands. My dad and my grandmother were at odds, their alliance shattered as old wounds were ripped open. I watched as our family, the one that had always seemed so strong and united, crumbled before my eyes. It was a scene I never thought I'd witness, the kind of drama you read about in books or watch in movies but never expect to happen to you. Christmas was officially ruined, not by a lack of gifts or a burnt dinner, but by the revelation of secrets that had been festering beneath the surface for decades. The fallout lasted for months. Some family members stopped speaking to each other, alliances were formed, and a cold war of sorts gripped our once tight-knit group. The DNA test eventually confirmed my grandmother's worst fears, but by then, the damage had already been done. The Christmas that had started with laughter and love had ended in heartbreak and division, and no amount of holiday cheer could ever patch the wounds left behind. I used to think adulthood would be a clear path away from childhood traumas, but I was wrong. Last week, in the corners of my mind, I brushed against memories I thought I'd buried forever. The night started as an innocent meet-up with old friends by the lake, our childhood hangout spot, but it turned into something far darker. I hadn't seen Thomas, Sarah, and Jenna in years. We laughed, reminisced about the wild days of running through the woods, building forts, and stealing sips of cheap beer. Everything felt perfect. Until it didn't. As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness crept over the water, and a sudden chill set in. We decided to take a nighttime stroll along the shore, the moon casting eerie reflections on the rippling lake. That's when Sarah suggested we share ghost stories, the kind we used to tell that raised goosebumps on our skin as kids. Everyone was in, but the mood turned when Jenna spoke up. "There's the old Adams house," she said, her voice low and trembling with something else, fear. "You remember what happened there, right?" Suddenly, laughter faded, and memories retreated into the shadows. I could practically feel the air grow thicker as she recounted the legend of a boy named Alex. Years ago, he had gone missing in that house, supposedly wandering off in search of something in the dark. It was said that he still roamed the halls, waiting for someone to find him, and if he did, he'd only show himself to people with unfinished business. I scoffed at first, brushing it off as silly storytelling, but inside, a part of me shuddered. The unfinished business line stuck with me. I had left my childhood in shambles, departing before I could confront the things that haunted me, my family's issues, my mother's suffocating love that felt more like a noose, and my father's empty chair at dinner, a constant reminder of his absence. To distract myself from the creeping dread, I decided to take a walk away from the group, feeling the cool breeze on my skin. That's when I found myself standing in front of the Adams house, its decaying frame illuminated ominously by the moonlight. I don't know how I got there. Perhaps part of me was drawn by curiosity, or perhaps it was a desperate instinct to face the silence that had haunted me for so long. Against my better judgment, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. As if the house had been waiting for me, the musty air swallowed me whole. I could hear the floors creaking beneath my weight, a soft symphony of the past whispering secrets and sorrows. Memories flooded my mind, days spent battered by bullying, nights drenched in loneliness, and the distant echo of my parents' fights. The walls had seen it all, they almost seemed to breathe with the weight of their stories. I moved deeper into the house, compelled by a force I didn't understand. Climbing the staircase, I reached a room at the end of the hallway, a door slightly ajar. In that instant, I felt my heart race, as if my own childhood struggles were waiting there for me. I pushed the door open, and the room seemed to welcome me, coated in layers of dust and neglect. In one corner sat a child's rocking chair, its paint chipped, and on the wall hung an old photograph of a boy with bright eyes. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The boy looked eerily familiar. As I approached, memories hit me harder than before. The boy in the picture was Alex. Suddenly, I was pulled into a vivid memory from my childhood, one I had mercilessly tucked away. There was a hollow ache in my chest as I recalled a time when I had bullied Alex, a shy kid with a love for drawing. We had mocked him for his eccentricity, laughed at his art, and chased him away from the group. I remembered the day he stopped coming to school, the rumors, and the sense of guilt lounging in the back of my mind, unresolved, unknown. I hadn't known that something horrible had actually happened. It was like a cruel twist of fate that brought us both to this very house. The air thickened, the shadows twisting around me, and in that moment, I realized, Alex was not just the boy who had gone missing, he was also a part of me I'd buried under layers of denial. I was wrong, I whispered into the silence, releasing the words I had long held captive. I didn't understand. I'm sorry. At that instant, I felt a warmth envelop me, something I hadn't felt in years, a soft feather-like touch that washed over my skin like the gentlest of hugs. The room began to shimmer and glow, and I saw him standing in the corner, that same boy with bright eyes, watching me with a hopeful intensity. I forgive you, he said, his voice echoing softly around the room. Tears streamed down my cheeks as the weight of everything I had locked away began to unravel the tight grip I had on my heart. The shadows receded, and clarity found its way back into my soul. In the child's eyes, I saw both innocence and a depth of understanding that I never thought possible. Will you come back? He asked, his voice growing fainter. When you're ready, will you take what you've learned and share it with others? And with that, he began to fade. I didn't want him to leave. I will, I shouted, desperation clinging to my breath. I promise. And with that last echo, I jerked awake, finding myself lying on the floor of the abandoned room, the sun breaking through the window, washing everything in golden light. I stumbled outside, where my friends were waiting anxiously, worry etched across their faces. They asked where I had gone, and I shared the truth, the story of Alex, the haunting memories, and how in facing them, I found what I had long sought, healing. It wasn't just Alex's spirit that I had unburdened, it was my own. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, feeling lighter as the weight of childhood remorse began to slip away. That night, we gathered at the lakeside again, and as the stars twinkled above us, I shared my story, hoping that others could learn from it. I found a space to share my pain, to let go of the past, and to find redemption not only for Alex but for myself. When I faced my past, I didn't just find memories of shadows and sorrow, I discovered a path to healing, one that I would carry forward as a guiding light. Sometimes those invisible chains bind us tightly, but it takes a spark of courage to break free. Now, I'm on a journey to speak out about the experiences we bury, to honor those like Alex lost to our neglect and indifference. I found solace not just for myself but also the courage to face the past and gift others the chance to heal. All it took was one night, one forgotten house, and a long overdue apology to the boy who had been waiting all along.